Welcome to Off Panel. Yo everyone, welcome to Off Panel. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is a return visitor to the show. He's the writer of comics like Nailbiter, Birthright, Frostbite, The Flash, and the top-selling comic in the industry this past month, Justice League vs. Suicide Squad. It's Joshua Williamson. Thanks for coming on, Joshua.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's always good to talk to you.
So, I gotta say, I have to imagine that was your first time topping the sales charts for the direct market?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess that Joshua Williamson star is on the rise.
I mean, that's a book where it was like, I mean, I'm how do I put this in a modest yet realistic way? It's like, I'm very glad I got to do it. They put a lot of work into that book. I mean, it was intense, dude. Like, there's a lot of people, a lot of thought, and a lot of back and forth to try to make that book. And so, I can't take credit by myself for one thing, you know, like, I think that's not only just selfish but unrealistic.
Yeah.
What we went through making that book. But come on, it's Justice League and Suicide Squad. You know, these two huge properties. And I think people were excited about it.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm thankful the retailers were kind of like, all right, cool, I can sell this.
Yeah. I just think it's I don't know. Regardless of the fact that, like, you know, you're realistic enough to be like, well, I mean, Justice League and Suicide Squad are gigantic, and they probably sold it for the most part. But still, I have to imagine it's like pretty rad being like number one.
Oh, it is pretty rad to be number one. Yeah, but it reinforces that idea in my head about how you never rest. You know, it's very like I was talking about this with somebody else earlier. It's not like, you know, I actually found out yesterday or 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of knew back in December, but it was like one of those things you don't know for sure. And I knew bits and pieces of things back in December, and I was at DC last week, and so I knew a little bit. But it's not like I can, like, you know, crack open a bottle of champagne and celebrate. It's like I gotta get back to work. You know, like the work is not over. I mean, that's one thing interesting about comics is that, like, it isn't. Oh man, I'm gonna get into like some deep stuff here, possibly, maybe depressing. I don't know. Have you ever seen The Aviator?
Yeah.
The Scorsese. I feel like that movie. I like watching it. Sometimes I will watch it, and I will stop watching it the moment he does the movie premiere at the beginning. Because the beginning of that movie is all about how he's just like, I'm you know, making this movie, and everyone thinks I'm crazy, and no one believes in it.
Right. And
then he goes, he makes the movie, and he's sitting in that chair, and he's just nervous. You know, he's freaking out, basically. And the movie ends, and everyone stands and they applaud, and they're like, this was an accomplishment, right? If you end the movie right there, it's terrific.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and there are no moments. That's the thing. That's the reality, is that you keep going, right? You got to go to work the next day, and that's how it is with comics, right? It's like there's no moment where you're like, oh man, this issue 1 came out, people liked it, it sold well, I did it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, no, now where's issue 2, and then what happens after that, and then you got work to do, and it's like, you know, got to keep putting out books.
Yeah.
And so even though, like, yeah, it's like, oh, we had a number 1 and I had my name on a book, and I'm really proud of it, and I'm happy with what we did. Like, I think we made what we set out to do. And it's exciting. Like, I'll have that hardcover in my hand someday, and I'll just be like, all right, cool, you know?
Yeah.
But it's also hard to celebrate when it isn't over too, right? Like, there's another 2 issues that need to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very like, and it's all done. Like, we've been done for a little bit, but it's just one of those things where I'm just like, I don't know, I gotta get to work. And, you know, the moment we were done working on that, I remember Jeff called me after I had done issue 1. I think I was writing issue 2. Jeff called me to give me a note about something that I was really excited about. And then he was just like, and then, you know, next time I see you, we'll talk about the Batman Flash crossover.
Yeah.
And so even though I'm like, you know, kind of in the middle / starting Justice League Suicide Squad, we were already talking about the Batman Flash crossover then, which we knew we were going to do a long time ago. But it's just that thing where it never stops.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's just, just keeps going.
Yeah, I was going to make a much more Philistine reference. It's kind of like, if you look at like The Breakfast Club and you look at like Judd Nelson at the end and he pumps his fist and you think he's totally awesome. But at the same time, Judd Nelson's character probably is like a total lame-o in his life because he just kind of a slacker and probably didn't keep working or anything like that. That's like the negative way to go. You got to keep pushing yourself like Howard Hughes. Maybe not exactly like Howard Hughes, but, in the same vein, you got to keep working.
I relate a lot to Howard Hughes in that movie. Sadly, there's a lot of moments in that movie where I'm like, oh man, I feel you, man. I feel you.
Yeah. So the central premise of this podcast is I was going to ask you 20 questions. And incredibly, I haven't actually asked you one of them yet. I wanted to begin at the end in true Harry Potter fashion, because one thing that is coming up, speaking of endings, is Nailbiter's ending with issue number 30 in March. I was really curious. That actually kind of snuck up on me. I saw Mike Henderson tweet about that book ending. He's like, finished up all the, 31 issues, or I guess it's 30 issues of Nailbiter.
Well, it's 31 because he's counting the Hack Slash issue.
Oh, okay. So 31 issues, all this different stuff. And I was like, holy crap, I actually didn't realize it was ending because I'm a trade waiter and I've been like a super slacker in keeping up with comics news. So it was kind of surprising to me. I'm curious, like, what made that the right point to bring the story to an end?
Well, there's a couple things with that. What's funny is that we knew for a little bit and we waited to announce it. Like, we didn't announce it until the middle of December.
Right.
It wasn't that long ago. We just kind of waited. We didn't want to like have a thing where it was a big deal, a big ending, and we felt like we wanted to kind of have it be sudden, because I think that's also an element of horror, is sudden reveals and sudden shocking things.
Sure.
And I think there's this thing about movies and video games and novels and comics, right? That like when you're reading a novel, you can tell in your fingers you're getting close to the end.
Right.
Right. When you're watching a movie, you can kind of tell. I think you're kind of there's an internal clock. You can tell it's 2 hours, 3 hours. It's interesting when you're watching like a TV show and you pause it for a moment, you realize there's like 2 minutes left. Mm-hmm. And you're kind of aware, right? Like there's a passage of time. Video games is something that's a little harder on that. I think video games, you can go and be like, man, this is never going to end. But I think that's one of the elements of horror too, is that you don't completely know what's coming, right? And I think if we had told people like, this is the issue that's going to be the end way early, it would have taken away from that. But what we did was we waited until after 27 came out. And 27, ended with kind of a big cliffhanger. And so to have 27 come out and then be like, oh, by the way, this is the end. Like, it makes that tension more real. Like, it kind of adds. And that was part of our motivating in that. What's funny is you and I sat down at Emerald City Comic Con last year, almost a year ago, and I pretty much knew then. I remember you and I were talking about Nailbiter, and I kind of knew then. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of factors to consider. The story being the biggest one, right? And are we going to drag this out? Are Mike and I going to drag this out? And Mike and I were just talking about this yesterday or 2 days ago, and we were like, we could have gone another 10 issues, but, and I know what those 10 issues would have been, but we probably would have been dragging it out a little bit. We would have probably been delaying it too much. Like we knew the direction we were going, and I could have stopped and been like, oh, here's, 10 issues worth of mysteries I can drop in the middle here. Or I could be like, no, this is the natural path. This is the moment.
Right.
There was also the, Mike's been working on this book for a long time. I've been working on it since 2011.
Right.
And Mike started working on it in 2013. Mm-hmm. So he started working on it, I think, like June of 2013. So it's like, that's been a part of his life over 3 years.
Right.
And so I think he was definitely getting a little antsy. That's a guy who wants to do space stuff. He wants to draw superheroes. He wants to draw Superman and Thor, and he wants to do big Star Wars space battles. And he's been drawing people standing in a field for 3 years. And I think he just started really getting antsy about it. And so there's just this, and that book was the easiest one to write for me. I would talk to him about it. We would just kind of like write it very grindhouse style and just sort of, I don't know, it was always building toward a cliffhanger, right? And so there was all these little factors. And then there was also the sales. Like the sales were going down, not drastically. Like, I mean, I look at the sales numbers. We talked about this. And I'm pretty aware of what books sell and kind of what's going on in the market. And it's like, we still sell well. but I didn't want to get to a point where I knew that we were not selling well
Yeah.
and just keep going just because, which I think people do. Like sometimes they just keep going. You know, there's a lot of talk about on independent books where people are like, oh, you know, the trade. And I think it's kind of gone away a little bit where it was like, well, trade's where you make the money. And it's like, you should make money on the single issues. Like you
Right.
should want to make money on the single issues. And I've always been able to make sure that everyone got their page rates on the issues. Like everyone has been able to get the money on the issues, right? And like, because you can't depend on those royalty checks. You don't know for sure how much it's going to be. It's so based on sales,
right?
That it's like, you don't know for sure. You don't. And sometimes it'll be more, sometimes it's huge, and sometimes it's small, and it's surprising. And it's a conversation I have with a lot of creators where they kind of talk about that. They're like, well, we'll make it up in the trade. I'm like, you don't know that, dude. Like, you don't. I wanted to make sure we always were able to do that. And I was doing the math. And I remember around issue 8, I sat down and I was like, this is where I think we're going to be at 11, and this is where we're going to be at 16. When we got to issue 16, I was off by 3 copies.
Wow.
And so I knew, I was like, all right, well, if that's our attrition rate at this point, and we don't do any more variant covers, and we don't do this, and we don't do that, this is where we're going to be at by 26, 27. This is where we're going to be at by 30. And so we kind of, we talked about it a lot. And it was this thing about like, Mike and I always talk about every 5 issues we would sort of plan. By 21, we were dead on where we thought we were going to be in terms of numbers.
Right.
And we pushed that. We tried to push 21, but we still ended up being exactly where I thought we were going to be. And so I was 30 is a good number. 30 is a good place to end it. And it actually made me aware of like a lot of books that I want to do. And Birthright's not ending at 30, but it made me aware of create your own books. And I think 30 is a good place to end create your own books on.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
I think when I was reading a CBR interview you guys did about it, and one thing that Mike said really stood out, where he was saying about how all of his favorite things in fiction, I think he was quoting like Vince Gilligan from Breaking Bad, and he was talking about how like you want to end when like people still, more or less, you want to end when people still like you, because if you wait long enough, people won't like you anymore. It's kind of like it's like the Aaron Eckhart, Harvey Dent quote from Dark Knight. And it's like, you either die the hero or live long enough to become the villain. But sometimes that works in art too. It's like you don't want to stay so long that people get tired of you, but both in the creative standpoint, but also in the sales standpoint, because one day the sales might just not be there, and then you're upside down and you're not able to pay the page rates, and that can be complicated. But I actually wanted to ask about, we've talked about this a bit off the record. We've seen a lot of talk from retailers and certain comic sites about kind of like the tenuous state of comic sales right now. And, we haven't really seen much from the creator perspective. When conversations like that start happening, does that kind of change? I mean, I'm not saying this happened necessarily on Nailbiter, but does that kind of change the way you plan the projects you take on or how you approach them?
Yes. But as you said, we've had this conversation before.
Right.
It was pretty evident to me, and I actually didn't have as much of a doom and gloom attitude, and I'd have this conversation with other people. I was not so doom and gloom about things at the end of 2000, not even the end of 2015. I would say like spring of 2015. I think you could look out at the market and you could have these conversations, and you and I would talk, and I would talk to retailers. I would go to Comics Pro and I would sit there and talk with them and ask them and call them. I mean, that was one thing about when I was working at Dark Horse and just on Nailbiter and Birthright. Like, I would call retailers and talk to them, and I would get a lot of feedback. And so, I would sit there and at conventions, I would seek retailers out and ask their perspective on things. And so you get around like the spring of 2015 or like fall 2015, it was kind of obvious to me that there was going to be a tightening, right? Like, I didn't think there was going to be as much, you hear these stories about retailers closing, and like, I hadn't considered that. I hadn't thought about that as much, but I felt like there was a tightening coming. And I felt like, it's kind of weird. Like, I would talk to other creators about this, and I would be very like, I think that getting jobs in the next 2 years is going to be challenging. It's going to be more competitive, and certain people are going to lock down where they're at again.
Right.
And so when I started thinking about Nailbiter and Birthright and doing another Image book and doing, was I going to make an effort to work for Marvel or DC? And I felt like DC was where I wanted to be, and that was where I was kind of I don't know, man. It was like I was more patient, I think, about it,
Sure.
but at the same time, very aware of what I wanted to do. On a creative standpoint, I felt like I was a little burnt out on Creative Round too while this was happening. Like I just felt like I was very happy with Nailbiter. I was very happy with Birthright, and there were other things that were kind of in the works that I was happy with. But past that, I felt like every idea I had was bad. Like I was just kind of like coming up with ideas, and I would talk to people, and you could just tell it's just like blank faces, you know. And I wasn't even excited about it. And I kind of felt like I needed to take a step back from Creator Owned a little bit. Like I needed to kind of recharge and find a new challenge. And I felt like doing a superhero book again, something like The Flash, was going to be that challenge. And I was also obsessed with The Flash. But yeah, I mean, dude, I was talking to a lot of creators at the end of 2015, and all of us were sort of aware there was a change coming. There was something coming up, and it definitely impacted my decisions on my career and what I was gonna be doing over the next few years. Not just over 2016. I mean, I started being exclusive at DC before The Flash even came out. I kind of was aware of what I wanted to do, and it made me rethink my plans.
Yeah.
For my career based on that, and looking at the numbers, not just Nailbiter numbers, but everybody's numbers. And again, if you talk to retailers, if you talk to retailers, they're pretty honest with you.
Oh yeah.
And there was one retailer I sat down with and had dinner with, and I just asked them like every question I could. That's I wanted the larger accounts and really got their take on things. And they are not doom and gloom. Like they're not very like, oh, this guy is falling, everything's going to go to crap. But we had a very, honest conversation about where they thought things were going, and it just, it made me more aware.
I think what you use tightening instead of doom and gloom, and I think tightening is probably more accurate. I mean, not to say that the shops that are going out of business aren't actually going out of business.
Oh, no,
I mean, like that's a real thing, but it does seem like most shops are just kind of doing like incrementally worse. But like you look at somebody like Brian Hibbs put out his his sales report for the year for his shop or his shops, and he was saying that and he still he still was up. I mean, Challengers was still up. Like a lot of shops are still up. It's just less up, and it's like especially in the latter half of the year, things just weren't kind of working in the way that they were before. But that was you were kind of talking about how you're talking with retailers and everything like that. One thing I'm always curious about is like, is that something that creators talk about? Like I know if I went and talked to my coworkers about my salary, they would freak out and just shut up. They just wouldn't talk. But I mean, to a certain degree, like that's kind of what you guys are talking about. The business of comics and stuff like that is kind of comparable to it. Is that something creators talk about when you guys are when we're going through a period like this?
Yeah, of course. I think that, a lot of us are friends, and we work with each other, and I don't know, we're all a bunch of goths. That's part of the problem. But, we're very conscious of that. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some lines and there are some boundaries, and I think you're not going to be totally open with every single person you talk to. But definitely you have friends that work in this industry that, that you just kind of talk to about it. And, I remember you talk to certain creators that are struggling, right?
Right.
And what I was talking about was I felt like there was a tightening coming. Today, I think when Comic Ron was talking about all the the sales growth, that like 2012 was a huge burst. Then after that, it kind of started going down in terms of growth.
Yeah.
And then last year was good, mostly because of Star Wars. And then, 2015 was Star Wars. 2016 was a lesser growth, and it kind of makes everyone freak out. The interesting thing is that the growth, it didn't go down.
Right.
It's not like we did less than last year, right, or less than these previous years. We just didn't grow as much.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting to me is you have these conversations with people who are like, "There's too many books." And that's another thing. There's so many books. And I think everyone is like, there needs to be less books. There's too many books. There needs to be less books. There's too many books, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then publishers kind of take that to heart, and they start doing less books. And everyone's like, "Oh my God, what's happening? We're not making as much money." You're like, "Well, yeah, there's less books." Like, I think that's definitely a thing that will continue to happen.
Yeah.
And I think people are right. There are so many books. And because there's so many books, there's so many more options.
Right.
People are dividing up their money and dividing up their attention across that huge landscape. And so that is something that a lot of, when I was talking about the tightening, I felt like that was part of it, was that I felt like all the publishers were going to start, I mean, Boom announced it, right? Like, Boom announced they were going to make less books.
Right.
And so I think that was something that all those creators were kind of talking about, like, oh man, like there's going to be less books, and creators aren't going to greenlight as quickly as they used to.
Yeah, less opportunity.
So, yeah. So I was talking about that stuff, and then it is kind of a bummer. Because you see it online. You see people online sometimes that are like, hey, I need a job. Anybody hiring?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bummer. And so, yeah, a lot of us do talk about that kind of thing. I mean, it's just a bummer when you have a friend that's having troubles finding work. It's not, that's a conversation I feel like happens all the time.
Yeah.
It was like, I started writing comics and trying to self-publish back in like 2000, 2001. I don't really feel like I was really, could sustain that. Like actually work on comics until 2012. Like 2011 was okay. 2012 was the first time where I'm like, oh, cool, this is like sustainable. I can do this. Like I can really do this.
Right.
And I made the mistake of trying to go freelance in 2008, which is like the beginning of the economic crash. So it was even particularly hard for me to get into it. And so I think that's still true, though. It's not like my experience was not exclusive to me. There was a lot of creators that had that experience and are still having that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't take it for granted. Just because right now I have jobs doesn't mean I'm going to have a job 2 years from now.
I do think it's really funny that you point out how like people are saying there's too many comics, and then they start making less comics and sale, like, and this numbers are predictably down. But I haven't really seen a lot of people point that out as a possible reason. I'm sure John Jackson Miller did at Comic-Con, because he points those things out like crazy. Whether or not people read that far into the article is an entirely different story.
Yeah, I might be wrong. I mean, that's always the thing with all this stuff. Like, I'm not an expert on this stuff. I'm aware of it. I think because I worked at a store for so long, I just kind of ingrained in who I am. I might be wrong. Maybe the hope is less books will do something different than what I'm thinking.
No, I think you're actually exactly right. And I think that in a weird way, and it's funny because like I think I got a rep for kind of trashing DC for a while. Like people thought I actually hated DC as opposed to I'm just like writing about DC and like just because that's what I'm writing about.
I never thought that.
I had several people tell me that, and I was just like, no, that's not the case. And now I think I'm kind of getting the rep for Marvel, actually, because I keep having people on my podcast who say bad things about Marvel. I'm like, I'm not saying it. I'm just having people on who are saying what they think. But anyways, I actually think DC handled it really well. Like the way that they've handled Rebirth was really smart, because they had less titles, but they double shipped them, which means that people kind of get more. They get the same amount of comics, but they get less titles, but they get the same amount of comics that they were getting before. They're just getting more of what they kind of more wanted. Like it's like it's harder to sell. I don't know. I'm trying to think of it. Like Doomed. You remember that, like the Doomed DCU book? That book's kind of a hard sell. It's a lot easier to sell, like, Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason doing Superman twice a month.
And that's one thing. Well, go on.
No, just go ahead.
I was going to say, that's part of why when I went exclusive, though, I don't think DC is shying away from doing books like that, though. I mean, one of the conversations I've had with them, and I had with them recently again, was that it's like, yeah, okay, so I'm on the Flash. I do the Flash, twice a month. Instead of me doing the Flash and some other book, I do the Flash twice a month, right? However, like they do encourage us to pitch, to present ideas about books that could be a risk. Like they want us to come at them. And they're like, let's tell a story. Tell a story. What story do you got? I had this. I had breakfast with Dan last week, and he was very like, "Do not worry about that stuff.
Right?
Like, you need to not. I can be a stressed out person, and I am. As we have these conversations about the money side of things. Like I don't hold back when I'm having conversations with people. So I was, I've been told, like, listen, tell a story. What are stories you want to tell? What are characters you like and you want to tell? Don't worry about the rest of that. Don't get caught up in that. Like, you need to focus on this. And they do encourage that. So it's like, I don't think those kinds of books are going to go away. There might be less of them. But I think, DC's definitely raised the bar for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
to keep that going, you got to be hard. One of the conversations I had with them recently was about how you go back to when I first pitched the Flash to DC, and they said no. The notes that they gave me then, those notes are still real. They still apply to anything I pitch them. And so there's times where I will be thinking about a story and something I want to do, and I go back to that moment and I think about the notes they gave me then. I'm like, do those notes still apply? Because if they do, then this would be a mistake. Like, I have to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. DC is a very good company to work for. I mean, for me at least. Like, I really enjoy it, and I think they do encourage us to try to take some risks. To present like that.
Well, I want to talk about some other risks that somebody else was doing, because I wanted to ask. I always like bringing up your amazing theories that you have, and I want to bring back. Back the Applecart theory. For listeners who are not familiar with Josh's Applecart theory, it's something brought up on a previous podcast where effectively, he says that renumberings are effective because if sales regress back to the status quo eventually, then renumberings still led to temporary, thus overall for the year, growth. I wanted to ask about Marvel's latest number ones. Do you feel like their latest number ones what's that?
I knew you were going to ask me about that. Go ahead.
Do you feel like it challenged your Applecart theory, or do you feel like they're exempt from the Applecart theory because they're not technically renumberings?
Oh man, that's tough. I don't think that renumbering once a year is a good idea.
So you think there's like a cap on the Applecart theory?
I think there is a cap on that. I think you can do it, but it does challenge my theory on it, right? How about this? I understand.
Yeah.
Like, I understand why, and it makes sense why. And if you look at those numbers, they did sell better for that month. So it 100% makes sense. Do I think it is a great idea? I'm not as much of a fan of it. And that's for me, considering that, like, I came on The Flash with the number one. Right? Like, there's a lot of advantages to it. I understand why Marvel does it. From a creative standpoint, it makes sense. I understand the season model. I don't know. Like, I think retailers aren't that excited about it. I think it's hard because it creates a break in your story.
Right.
Like, I mean, I think about how with The Flash, like, how far out I'm working right now and how far ahead I am right now. I'm really thankful that The Flash didn't end at 12, right? Like, I mean, the conversations that I'm having with my editors about the future stories and the stuff we want to do that we're really excited about, those stories are only, I'm trying to not spoil anything in The Flash, are only going to make sense and be as meaningful as they are because we were able to build it.
Yeah.
And I mean, look at Bendis. I mean, Bendis has been Guardians of the Galaxy for a long time. He's just now wrapping it up, and I feel like he was able to tell a big story with it, right? Like, I think he has something that he wanted to do. I wonder if you're allowed those kinds of opportunities. They didn't restart Daredevil, right? That one kept going.
No, they restarted it. God, I don't even remember when they restarted it. It
restarted it last year.
Yeah, after Secret Wars. So yeah, when Ron Garney and Charles Soule came on.
That's okay.
Yeah,
because they didn't start it now. There's not a Daredevil number one coming out right now. It just kept going with Charles. See, I think it's a mistake to do it across the board, but I think it's okay to do it occasionally. I don't know. I think it's tough.
It
is definitely challenges my idea of it. But again, like I said back then, like, I understand the reasons why to do it.
Yeah.
And there definitely are creative benefits to having a number one. But I feel the pain of fans and retailers who are not as excited about it. I think the difference with the DC one was, a lot of those books had been going for 52 issues.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about from the end of, September of 2011 until June of 2016 is a long run.
Right.
Every year I think is hard, man. Every year I think is hard, but that definitely challenges my Applecart theory. It's like they're still getting that growth on that issue.
Right.
Right. The downside is this, and this does happen occasionally. I don't think it's exclusive to Marvel. It can happen at any publisher. Is if you do that number one and it sells less than the previous last issue of the series. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
That's when there's a problem. I mean, when I did RoboCop, my RoboCop number one came out like the month after they had wrapped up like the Frank Miller RoboCop story,
Right.
right? They had done this big like redo of it, and they ended it, and then RoboCop number 1 came out immediately after. Our numbers were less than that issue because I think retailers are like, it's a number 1 of RoboCop. Why would I order number 1 numbers on something when like literally the month before these were the numbers? So like I know what I can sell at RoboCop.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know. So that's when it sucks. When things like that happen, and I don't think that's exclusive to just Marvel or any one publisher, any publisher. Whenever that happens, oh, that's a bummer. Like I think that's definitely like put the test to my my theory. My theory about that is really about understanding why publishers do it.
Oh, sure.
Because you get people who are very like angry, and they think that it's like a personal attack, and it's like, no, this is why they do it. Like think about this like a business for a moment. This is why they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean they do it because it works. I mean, like you said, even these did work. I think the thing that like the last couple of years, especially for Marvel, just because they've had so many new number 1s and everything, is it's made me realize I was always a huge proponent of the season model from both a reader standpoint and from a pundit standpoint. But the funny thing is I've kind of turned on it because unless you have like a clear plan for it, it actually it's made me realize that comic book readers are so habitual, and that any break in that, it really like it's proven that the jumping off point kind of is a real thing just as much as the jumping on point can be, and it's complicated. Yeah. I understand why they do it, and I also understand why readers and retailers are like, stop it.
Yeah. I think if there's a clear reason and it feels big and it feels, important, then I think it makes kind of sense. But I mean, you go back to '94 and 0 Hour happens, and like I'm a big fan. I love 0 Hour, and all those awesome. 0 Hours just come right. Yeah, and I think for me as a kid, like I was already reading, DC Comics at that point. I was reading everything.
Yeah.
Like I would go to Costco and we would get these gigantic packs of comics, and it would be like all of DC stuff, and like it'd be like a month's worth of DC Comics for like $20 or whatever it was at the time. And it was great. And I was, 92 was when I started going to my comic shop on a regular basis, and I had a subscription and all this stuff. But 0 Hour happened, and 0 Hour really gave me a entry point. And like Superboy, I had already been reading Superboy, but Superboy had a 0 Hour, and I was already reading Aquaman had a 0 issue. And but it gave you kind of an opening. And I've actually mentally, I haven't really talked about this publicly, I think, but mentally Rebirth reminded me a lot of 0 Hour in a way where it was like, because all those 0 Hour issues were essentially like, this is who this character is.
Mm-hmm.
This is their origin. Like we got a snippet of their origin.
Right.
It was changes and it was little things. It was a snippet of their origin and then a snippet of what the story was going to be. Very similar to what I think Rebirth was. Yeah. Right. But I think about 0 Hour a lot. And so when I'm a kid, 0 Hour happens. Some books restarted. Some books just kept going, and then some books were being introduced. Like we got Starman out of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wish there was more of that sometimes.
Yeah.
Maybe that's just me, like nostalgia kid kind of thing. But that's kind of how I wish things kind of went a little more sometimes. Like sometimes things restart, sometimes they don't. Sometimes things keep going. I don't know. I find the Marvel restarting after a year thing was very surprising. But I mean, if you have to, you have to.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a story reason for it, then that's all that matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the reason why there's been problems with it. Is it's hard to kind of figure out what the story reason is. But all right, I want to mix it up for a second. All right, so one of the random questions I want to ask you is, you've already talked about it. You're crazy busy. You're doing all these different projects. You're always jumping from the next one. You're a very scheduled person. Let's say you're snowed in and you have an evening to yourself, and for some reason there are no deadlines. You don't have to work. What do you do with your free time first and foremost?
That's a tough question. That never happened. It'll never happen.
So in this sci-fi reality, what would you do?
There's no deadline, and I'm by myself. I'm snowed in here in the house.
Yeah.
With sleep.
Oh my God.
I have a baby, No, I mean, I would probably watch a movie or read a book. I mean, you know what, honestly, to be 100% honest, the most honest answer I could give you is I would probably write.
Yeah.
I would probably sit with music in my notebook and I would probably write. Yeah. Like even before the baby was born, Saturday mornings, my wife and I would kind of go our separate ways. Like she would go do like, yoga and fitness stuff and hang out with her family. And then she would come home at 1. And I would wake up and it was, I'd make myself breakfast and I would take my time and I would really try to like enjoy not working. And I would sit and like, I'd clean. Do very like therapeutic things. I would clean, I'd take a bath for myself, pick up my office, I'd build a Lego set or something and listen to music. But every Saturday I'd always end up writing a little.
Yeah.
I would always sit there for like an hour or two in that time period. Cause I'd wake up early to make sure I could do all this stuff but I would take my time with it. I would always end up writing. That's how Flash Rebirth was written. I was cooking. I was making breakfast burritos. Nice. And I started thinking about Barry as a person, what's important to Barry, and I started thinking about Barry and his relationship with his dad. And I had to like go and grab my notebook and start writing, and like I literally normally will do all this stuff with a notebook next to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, if I all of a sudden had this moment where it was like that, man, I would probably just write. Either I would write for the Flash or I would write for myself. There was a moment last night. It's 11 o'clock at night. I'm like taking the dog out one last time, and I'm just thinking and about Barry and a conversation Barry is having with a character in a future issue. I don't want to spoil who it is yet. And I started thinking about the other characters' dialogue and the things they were saying and things I was excited about. I had to basically stop and go back to my office and write it down. Like I had to sit there, so, and that's one thing about, I think, the creative mind is at its best when it's relaxed, right? Like your mind in general is at its best when it's relaxed and it's not stressed and it's calm. I think that's why people, when they're in the shower, because it's kind of a private moment and you're kind of away from everything for that moment. That's why a lot of people get ideas then. I get a lot of ideas when I'm driving. Where it's just kind of these calm, moments. You're doing the same thing over and over again, right? Like you're just driving, and all I'm doing is focusing on the driving, and it allows my mind to kind of open up. So yeah, man, if I had a moment to myself like that, I know what would happen. I'd probably get ideas. I would hear the voices in my head, and like that's what really would happen.
Your slacker period is much more productive than mine. I'm very envious of your willpower. So back to productivity. I mentioned already that you are writing Justice League versus Suicide Squad, but you also are writing the half of DC's first Watchmen related crossover with the Button, which is a crossover with Batman. So I just have to ask. I mean, it's a big thing. It's kind of, everybody talks about it when Watchmen is involved. Is there like, I already kind of asked you about like freaking out about being number one, but is there a part of you, a fanboy part of you, that's kind of like, I'm doing my own 0 hour, I'm doing like this big crossover type thing, and it's pretty freaking rad? Sometimes. Oh man. Sometimes.
It's hard because you're working.
I know. You gotta.
Like, I got stuff to do, and I gotta focus on that. And it's like I just need to like get the stuff done. I need to think about the story part of it and make it good, right?
Yeah.
It's hard for me to stop and just be like
Chris Farley show.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. That's something I've had. I'm not as. I used to consider myself pretty self-aware, but I've had conversations with people recently where I am aware of the fact that my perspective of where I am at in my career and my perspective on the stuff I'm working on, I am not caught up to it, right? Like you were asking me about the Justice League Suicide Squad being the top seller. Like my brain hasn't processed that yet.
Yeah.
And with this, it's like, yeah, like I am in the room with Jeff and other creators, editors, and we're talking about plans going out to, like far out stuff, right? Like, oh, this is going to happen in this book in 2019, and this is the thoughts about this, and oh, we're talking about this, or well, this is how this story is going to end, and we're having these like big conversations about these things, and there are these moments where I'm like, man, we're not just like we're building the DC universe, right? And it's like it's odd because I've been talking about these characters and things I want to do with these characters since I was a kid, right? Where it's like, oh, working on Batman, this is what I would do. But now we're having these conversations, and I'm like, oh, here are the things I would do. Here are the conversations we would have about these characters, about the Flash and Batman. There was a moment last summer where Steve Orlando and we spent a lot of time in rooms talking about comics, where we built his Justice League team.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? For JLA #1. We had these conversations. Him and I have been texting about it for weeks before we got to the room, with Jeff and the editors, and we're like presenting the members and who's going to be on the team and our options and what we think and why they're there, right? And it's all very serious, and everyone's having these in-depth character conversations. And then in the night we were at dinner, and I was the one that I was like, we built the Justice League team today.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we really did it, and that's going to come out. And the team that we decided on that day in that room is the team that was announced.
That's
and
hilarious.
There were moments like that where it's like, oh man, we really did that. Like, we built the Justice League team. Like, that's something we joke around about. And you're always like, what's your team? What's your team? And why would you do that? But we did that. And so there are moments like that where it gets really, you slow down for a minute and you're like, oh man, we did that.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. And then you just get back to work.
Yeah. Well, you don't really have time to do it. It's always progressing. So if you just sat around and you're just like, oh my God, this is actually happening. You're like, shit, I just wasted an hour that I could have been writing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You gotta get back to work.
Time is currency.
Yeah. And we planned some stuff out so far in advance that also takes over your mind a little bit when it comes to it.
Yeah.
Like yesterday we announced Batman and Flash yesterday. Right? Yeah. I've been living with that for a long time. Like that's that's not new to me.
Yeah.
I've been in that conversation. I mean, the moment I turned in the Flash Rebirth script, I remember I had talked to Jeff on the phone that morning because he had some thoughts. He'd given me some notes, and I was like, all right, cool. I'll get back to you later today. And I wrote him back pretty quickly. I'm like, here's what I'm thinking for the end. And I wrote, made the changes to it. And I heard Jeff call me immediately. Or he didn't call me, emailed me immediately. It was really weird because I thought, like, Jeff's such a busy guy. It's going to take, like, hours.
Yeah.
Within 5 minutes, he had read it. Mm-hmm. And was just, like, super pumped about the idea of it. And then the next week, I was talking to the Batman editors. And it was like, that was that moment we knew, oh, this is eventually going to lead to, like, a Batman Flash crossover. Mm-hmm. And, man, that was a long time ago.
I know. I totally understand not freaking out about it because of the time period, because this is like a modest example, but a big personal example. The night I found out my wife and I's offer for our house was accepted, she was out for like a few hours, and then was somewhere that she couldn't get phone calls and everything. So she comes back, and when I tell her, she's like, just starts dancing and freaking out and getting really excited. And she's like, why are you excited? I'm like, I was excited 3 hours ago. I'm not excited anymore. And I imagine for 6 months, it's or like however long it's been, it's probably, you've had time to kind of deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then when everyone else gets excited about it, you're like, yep. Got to get back to work.
Exactly. I do want to say one thing about that book. I'm sure you can't go too far into details about it. But one thing I really like about it is the fact that they're making regular covers for it $2.99 and the lenticular covers $3.99. So there's like different flavors. Feels very much like a have your cake and eat it too plan. I like that.
Yes, it does. And I think me as a guy who has been reading comics my whole life, and I have seen it all, right? Like I've seen it all in terms of like books that have come out. The fact that I have a book with lenticular covers on it is super exciting. I'm sure some people are like, but I'm like, no, this is dope, dude.
Yeah.
Like, I'm gonna have that on my shelf. Come on, this is cool, right? Like every time I was in somebody's, I don't know whose office I was even in. I was in somebody's office, and they had a special cover that they were doing at conventions last year, and I was like, man, that's so cool.
Yeah,
so cool. Like, I know there's a weird energy, I think, sometimes in making comics when you've been reading comics your whole life that you kind of want to repeat certain things. And so for me, it's like I remember when I was first starting out, all I wanted was a trade, because that to me meant something. All I wanted was a trade, and then it was like, well, all I want is this. I remember, man, for a long time, all I wanted was an issue 2. Mm-hmm. Because I was always writing these short one-shot mini comics when I first got started, and so it was like all I want to do is have an issue 2 come out, and then it was all I want is a mini, and then all I want is an ongoing, and it was just like you keep advancing and stuff. So those covers are awesome.
Yeah, now you're like, now I want a lenticular cover, and I'm getting that next step, holofoil, perhaps hologram. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. I have to ask you this, and this may be getting you in trouble zone, but I'm going to put you on the spot. As a longtime comic fan, what was your initial response when you heard that the Watchmen were coming back into play in the DC universe? Did you have a strong response, or were you just like, that makes sense?
All right. There's a story here.
I'm sure there is.
So when I got the job in the Flash, I told this story before, so I'm not going to get myself in trouble.
Okay, good.
And I told the story before, and they know it. This is not like an unknown thing to them. I got the job in the Flash, and at that point, I think because I hadn't worked at DC in a little bit, but they knew I wasn't a crazy person. they were still protective of what the gigantic plan was.
Sure.
Right. So I start writing the Flash. I turn it in, working on outlines, and talking to them, and I've had conversations with Jeff about things. And I get a phone call on my birthday, and basically it's like, oh, by the way, and this is funny because it was a little different. It was like, by the way, Superman is dying and Wally West is coming back. And at the time I remember being like, oh my God, okay, well that changes some things. And I just got started. I'd only been writing at this point when this happened for like less than a month.
It is a hilarious, by the way, for a person who's writing the Flash, though.
Well, that's because that decision was made before that, right?
Oh, okay.
Like before I was writing the Flash, they already knew Wally was coming back.
Mm-hmm.
It was something that was like already on the docket. The reason why they were telling me in that moment was because at that point they were realizing you got to understand something. When you start writing a comic and you haven't done it in a while and it's a big deal and it's a Flash #1, there's still going to be some leeriness to certain things, right? Mm-hmm. But at this point they were like, all right, look, we need to bring him in. And they're like, Flash 9 is going to be about, Wally West and like the 2 Wally West meetings. Mm-hmm. So I knew that. God, I knew that. I mean, I knew that in December of 2015, and that issue didn't come out until October. Mm-hmm. So we knew, right? And so then it was also like, oh, Superman is dying. And so we started having all these conversations about that stuff, and that was going to impact what I was doing. And I was fine with that, because we just got started. And so we started working on all this stuff. Now, so I'm working on the Flash, I'm working on these things. Jeff was very secretive, rightfully so, of the Watchmen angle. Right. Comics, things get leaked all the time. It's annoying. It's a bummer. Mm-hmm. He didn't want that to happen. None of us wanted that to happen. Because of that, like, not everybody knew what was going on. With Wally West coming out, now I knew Wally West was coming back, and I knew that my Flash Rebirth was going to tie into Jeff's stuff. Like, I remember coming back into the office, sitting down with him, talking about Flash Rebirth, and then talking about, DCU Rebirth, and then talking about Flash Rebirth. Mm-hmm. And just having all these conversations about it. And he's like, there's a force, and I remember being in that meeting with him, and I asked him straight out, I was like, can you tell me who the bad guy is? Or not the bad guy, who's the character in the line? I know this is what I asked him.
Yeah.
This is what I always ask people when they're pitching me story ideas. I always ask them the same thing. I say, what's on the last page? Mm-hmm. That, to me, I love cliffhangers. And if your last page is boring and you can't even tell me what your last page is, there's a problem.
Yeah.
And I remember I asked him, I said, what's on the last page? And he just smiled at me. And he wouldn't tell me what it was. So, he gives me the script, but it's missing the last 5 pages, 6 pages. And I read the script. And so I read the script. I'm having conversations with him. I'm having conversations with different people. And I start building a picture in my head. And I'm like, I know what that last page is. It's one of 3 things. So I turn in my script for Flash Rebirth. And but I only turned in the first half of it.
Oh, okay.
Jeff reads it. He really likes it. But now he's like, okay, well, now we need to finish it. And I had outlined out the second half, but I didn't know exactly what was happening. Right?
Right.
So Jeff calls me up and we start talking about all this stuff about Rebirth. And so I said to him, I'm like, hey, can I guess what the last page is? Can I guess what the thing is?
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, yeah, but you're never gonna guess. And so I said, all right, here are my 3 guesses. And I was like, I think it's either Brother I has been watching them and ties back in Infinite Crisis. It's something with Max Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, no. And I'm like, all right, then it's the Legion of Superheroes from the future have become corrupted because the world in present day is corrupted, and so now the future is corrupted, and they've come back to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
No. I was like, all right. And then I just said, it's Dr. Manhattan. And just quiet on the phone. And then we started talking about it.
Nice.
Basically.
That's awesome.
And I don't want to get into that part of it too much because I don't want to, like, that's Jeff's business. That's Jeff's story, Oh, yeah. I think I just guessed. I mean, I really just guessed it. And so because I had made that guess, like the deductive reasoning to make that guess, I just had that conversation with myself a lot beforehand. So when I found out that is what was happening, again, I'd already dealt with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'd already thought about it extensively. That got me to that point where I was able to guess what it was. I thought I told you the story before, but yeah, that's what happened, I guess.
No, you didn't tell me.
I guess how. But that's it. Yeah, I mean, that was the thing. Well, in that up, yeah, like, it was just really cool to have that moment. I guess
that is hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question I have is actually the ending of a podcast we were going to end with this, but we didn't have time on my last one, so I have to ask, what did you think of the Suicide Squad movie? Super random, but I wanted to come back to this because you said you had thoughts.
Oh man, I like it.
Yeah,
I think it's bum rap.
Yeah.
I think it's bum rap. It was really a weird experience because I was already working on Justice League Suicide Squad at that time, but we hadn't announced it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to it watching it and thinking about that. I actually just rewatched it with a buddy of mine who's very skeptical about everything and anything, and we watched together. And I enjoy it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, it's fun. I like a lot of the vignette stuff. I like a lot of the characters. Boomerang is awesome. I feel like it's something that works. The only thing, and maybe you're probably gonna get me in trouble for this one. The only thing I'm not as much of a fan was some of the Joker stuff, but it's I haven't seen the extended cut yet. Like, I don't know how that stuff is in that.
Mm-hmm.
But I enjoyed it. It was funny because at the time it was getting such, like, there were people that were trashing it, but at the same time there were a lot of people that were really liking it.
Yeah.
I mean, it still went on to make a ton of money. Like, somebody must have been watching that movie multiple times.
Yeah.
And then you go to conventions and there is so much cosplay from that and those costumes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I enjoyed it. I think at the time I had more thoughts on it then, back in August, I think, because that was when we talked and I had just seen it.
Yeah.
So I had a lot more thoughts on it then, but now at this point, it's like I own it.
Yeah.
Like I said, I just watched the original, the theater take of it a few weeks back, I guess a month ago now. I enjoy it. I don't know. I think it's interesting how much people sort of hated on it at the time.
I think that kind of comes with the territory with those, because there's always going to be. I'm always kind of astounded by the Marvel versus DC lines that have been formed just in the movie front, which is weird because I feel like the movie front is far more impassioned than the comic side even. But I do have to compliment you for complimenting Boomerang, because I really have never liked Jai Courtney. He's always been one of my least favorite actors, and he was awesome as Boomerang. I could not believe how good he was as Boomerang.
Yeah, he was great. I remember that was the thing about watching with my buddy. He didn't know anything about it. Like, he knew stuff, and he knows comics and pop culture. But like that scene where the Flash shows up, and arrests, and stops Captain Boomerang. Like, he was very excited about that moment. So it was nice being able to see it with somebody else like that had no kind of pre-existing bias toward it either way.
Yeah.
And watch them kind of enjoy it.
Sorry, go ahead.
it's funny the lines that people have drawn in the movie side of things. Like, it's very weird, man. Like, but it makes sense. People are passionate about it, and it's, they feel invested.
Yeah.
Especially with the way these are, where they're so connected. It's no different than the comics. How invested people are in the lines and in the comics. It's just on a movie scale. I don't want to say a bigger scale, but a movie scale.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that to a certain degree, like, fandom these days is just like, it's like full on hysteria sometimes. So it makes sense that the response would be so strong. But all right, I want to tie into that. You are a longtime comic book fan. There's been a lot more adaptations these days. What's your favorite movie or TV adaptation of a comic?
Wow, man, that's tough.
It is tough.
Well, adaptation. I mean, adaptation is interesting.
Oh, okay, not adaptation. I don't know. I don't even know what you would call it, because it's like, you look at Captain America: Civil War. That's not an adaptation of Civil War. That's just a story that is called Captain America: Civil War. I kind of look at most comic book movies and TV shows as Elseworlds tales, where they're
same thing. That's interesting. I've had that same conversation with people where I'm like, people get really pissed off about something in a movie, and they're like, well, that's not how that character would act. And I'm like, think of it like it's an Elseworld, man. Like,
yeah, it's different.
You're not going to get so angry. I mean, are people out there like raging at Superman Red Sun, being like, that never happened?
He wasn't born in Russia, or wasn't flown to Russia.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's an interesting attitude that people have about it. I'm glad that you have that attitude. Answer your question. I mean, I feel like the answer I give will possibly be a cop-out. I mean, I love the Flash show.
Yeah.
I like a lot of the Batman movies, Batman, the 1989 and Batman Returns, and I like the Nolan one. But I think that the Flash show is very calculated in how much it feels right.
Yeah.
I remember I liked it when I first started watching it. I was a little behind because these things always... TV shows, like the CW shows, for whatever reason, always start the same week as New York Comic Con.
Oh, okay.
So it, like, inadvertently makes you already a week behind the moment it starts.
Yeah.
And so on the Flash show, I was behind like 2 or 3 episodes when it started. And so I sat, and I think I had seen like clips of it beforehand, but I sat down and watched a few episodes worth. And there was a moment I realized something, and I liked it, but something that really won me over, that really made me think like, this is well thought out, right? Like, that's always a thing where I feel like I appreciate things that are thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate, like, Walking Dead. I feel like it's thoughtful of the changes and the changes they make and why they point the show in different directions from the comic. And with the Flash show, I think there are certain elements. And the thing that got me over was, in comics, particularly the Flash comic, there are captions. Like, you get to hear the Flash think about what he's doing, what his plan is, what's going on inside his mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's hard to do on a TV show. Now, when the Flash show starts, they do have that opening intro of him talking to the audience, where he's like, "My name is Barry Allen, and the past is live," blah, 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 right? He gives you a little clue into it. And then the rest of the episode, he doesn't do that. In comics, again, particularly the Flash comic, he's constantly doing it. He's constantly talking to the audience. This is something that, Mark did, and Jeff did, and I do.
Mm-hmm.
They figure out a way of doing that. And that is that Barry is talking to Cisco and Caitlin.
Yeah.
And he's just having these conversations with them that are essentially those exact same conversations. There's a moment where he is like, he was going to like run around the city really quickly so he could have like a supersonic punch. And he was going to punch, I think it wasn't Girder. I'm forgetting right now. But
I think it was Girder, actually.
Yeah. So he's going to punch, I think it was Girder. He's going to punch him. And Cisco gets like super excited. He's like, he's going to do a super punch, right? And that was the moment I was like, oh man, that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what that is. Those are the captions.
Yeah.
Him talking with, and then they are explaining to you what he is doing.
Yeah.
Because they're watching it like you're watching it. And that was the moment where I was like, all right, you win. Like, I was already bored, but I really was like, this is thoughtful. This is somebody at some point was like, this is how we're going to do this. And I really like it a bunch. Like, all the CW shows are really fun. Like the fact that we have like this, the Flash and Supergirl crossovers. I like those a bunch. I like their friendship.
Yeah.
I like this, that there are 2 characters that are very optimistic, get to meet each other, and they, are just friends. It's very nice.
Yeah, I think that's actually the optimism is my favorite part about that. Oh, and that's why like my least favorite parts about the show is when it gets really dark. Not saying it shouldn't, because like bad things happen in it, but at the same time, it just kind of feels like it's the show's imbalanced when Barry is like very sullen. I'm like, that is Oliver Queen's territory. Stop brooding. You're happy. Well, I mean, the funny thing too is I kind of feel like my Wally West mind kind of imbues that characteristic on Barry, because the TV Barry kind of reminds me more of Wally, which is weird.
I don't know, man. I maybe because Wally, it was still in my head one way, and then now Barry is in my head in another.
Mm-hmm.
Like I see them as different characters. When I watch the show, I feel like that's Barry.
Mm-hmm.
Wally's always an interesting character because so much of Wally's character is coming out of somebody's shadow, and Barry never has that, and Barry doesn't have that on the TV show.
Mm-hmm.
Wally has different kinds of parental issues and different kinds of relationships than Barry has. Wally never had to live, at least as the Flash, never had to live with the secret identity thing until much later, until after Ignition.
Mm-hmm.
Wally's the character who won the lottery, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, literally won the lottery in that book. That is not a Barry thing. Barry would not win the lottery. And I think that's, with that show, I see Barry. Wally was never the aw shucks character.
Yeah, that's true.
But Barry is that on the show. I think we think of that because Barry, like a lot of superheroes from that time period, was older.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always think of Wally as younger. And so when we watch it, we automatically are like, we're talking about Barry should be old and Wally should be young. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's part of why people automatically are like, this is more like Wally. Yeah. So when you start actually breaking down some of the characteristics, I think he is very Barry.
I feel like I trust your mindset on this, especially given the fact that I'm just like a Wally West homer. All right, so next question for you. Let's talk about art. You've worked with a lot of crazy, amazing artists in the past, and I'm curious as to how, for writers, how your approach changes to scripting, depending on the artist, if at all. So, like, let's say you're working with Mike Henderson. And he's particularly to me he's just a fantastic character artist. I think he's just really incredible at that. Would you script differently for him than say Jason Fabok on, or I may have mispronounced that, on like more action oriented book like Justice League versus Suicide Squad, or does it really not make a difference depending on the artist?
Well, Mike is a very particular interesting situation. I've worked with Mike for so long that my scripts with him are crazy loose at this point, and we talk a lot. Mm-hmm. We text. I see him in person. We will meet up sometimes and just talk out an issue page by page before I even write it. So that's a very different experience.
Yeah.
Now working with Jay, like Jay is somebody I actually worked with. It was my second job at DC, and it was his very first job at DC. Back in like 2009, we worked together back then. Mm-hmm. And so with him, like we'd worked together then. I learned a lot about formatting and changing my scripts and writing. I mean, man, it's always about communication. Like, you always kind of present it in a way where it's like, this is what I'm thinking, let's talk about it. And that's how I write for all the artists. I really am. Like, a bad habit I had when I was way younger is I really would like dictate shots for every panel. And like now, sometimes if I have a very specific idea for a reason, I might say that, like, because I don't want to half-ass it too. Like, I want to make sure that it, like, I'm giving my all, and I'm not like shying away from giving my ideas to the artist. But it just becomes a conversation at that point. Like, that's one of my favorite parts about comics. Like, I like talking, like getting the roughs and having these conversations about them. But with Mike, man, it's so loose. Mm-hmm. I write very little for him. I know him. He knows me. He knows my ticks. I know his ticks. Working with someone like Jay, even though I've worked with him before, this is different.
Right.
And also with Nailbiter, there are fewer people reading it and fewer people that have to kind of, double check us essentially. And so it's like with these bigger books, something like that, I got to just be on top of it, and I have to put a little more into it. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, once you build a relationship with an artist, you put less and less because I mean, right now, with Carmine on Flash, the arc that's starting right now is this arc with the Rogue. And so when it comes to like action sequences, particularly, like I know Carbonet is going to just like go nuts with it. Like he's going to elevate whatever I'm thinking. And so I kind of keep that in mind when I'm writing, and I put maybe a little bit more work into some of the emotional, quieter moments.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I mean, obviously it's a rogue story. It's not a spoiler. The Captain Cold and the Flash fight at some point, but the two of them do fight at one point, and what I wrote was very grounded.
Right.
Like I wrote a very grounded story, and we started getting the pages back, and Carbonet, like, I mean, he took it to another level. It's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's one of those things where as I'm seeing it, I'm like, oh my God, I'm really glad he did that. I'm really glad he thought about that. I'm really glad he kind of like, just elevated. He ran with it. He made it stronger. And it's like, whenever that happens, that's great. And I know I can trust him on that. And I know he'll do that kind of stuff with fight scenes, particularly, or big time Flash action sequences. Like, I know he's going to do that. There's a moment in Justice League. I mean, those happy little things like that are so great. There's a moment in Justice League Suicide Squad #1 where Deadshot and Amanda Waller are talking. And Jay did this thing where it was like halves of their eyes. So like one side was Deadshot, the other side was Amanda Waller. That wasn't in the script, and it is genius. Like, it's a really great moment. And when I got those pages in, he was like, "Oh, I thought I would try this different thing." And I was like, "Dude, so good, so good." It is interesting, and I know you can tell. But one thing to keep in mind that is also important about some of this stuff is language barriers.
Oh yeah.
For a long time, sometimes some artists have translators. Sometimes they put them through like Google Translate or whatever. You have to be careful because some words mean different things to different people. I did a book back a long time ago called Johnny Monster,
mm-hmm.
and there was a scene where I was talking about this character was going to be wearing a hat. In my mind, I meant baseball hat.
Sure.
When the pages came back in, the guy was wearing a cowboy hat, and I asked him about it. He's like, "Oh, well, yeah, hat to me means cowboy hat. That's a cap. Like a baseball hat is a cap." And I was like, "Oh, the little things like that." Now imagine that on a bigger scale. And sometimes you're going to get happy things from it, and sometimes you're going to get things where you're like, "Oh man, I messed up."
Yeah.
One thing I picked up on, I don't know what book this was, actually, I don't remember, but I like when characters look at the reader a lot. I think it's a psychological thing, especially with bad guy characters. I know it's a film thing as well, that like, you have, if you look at a lot of movies that are psychological thrillers, they always have the villain look directly at the reader. You look at Silence of the Lambs, you look at Psycho, they always have the character look directly at the audience, and they do it on purpose for fear.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my books always have that. I like having characters look at the audience. And I kept putting, I think in the script, I kept putting, I used to write looking directly. No, I would say looking right at the reader.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it was.
Oh,
I would always write looking right. And they'd always draw them looking to the right of the reader.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to realize that I was the one messing that up. I was like, why don't they just looking right at the reader? What the heck? And then I was like, oh man, I'm being dumb, dude. And a lot of times it didn't matter, right? You're like, it still looks cool, moving on. If there was ever a moment where I was like, oh, this is what's going on, and then I clicked, I'm like, oh no. Yeah, they're doing they're doing what's in the script. I'm the idiot. I messed up. So I started changing that up to being like directly at the reader.
It's funny. I never thought about. I never thought about like language differences and language barriers and how that could or how that could change a script. You don't think about things like that as a reader, but it is funny to think about those happy accidents and sometimes like things that just come across differently without you really being aware of it until it happens.
Yeah. I mean, you have to sort of be careful about using certain phrases, right? Like certain things we might call something here means something completely different someplace else, or it just doesn't. It might be a saying that means nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to express a certain feeling for a panel. That's how I try to write now. Is I try to write like, here's who the character is, this is what they're doing, and then this is the subtext, this is the emotional thing that's going on. Less about stage direction.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, you try to express a certain emotion and you use emotive words, and then you realize like that doesn't mean anything to that person.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to kind of like go back through and double check yourself. Sometimes you leave them, sometimes you don't. Just depends.
Yeah.
But it does things. Yeah.
So the last few, I'm going to kind of end with like not really a speed round, but they're definitely like more, I don't know, less thorough questions, I guess. But I wanted to ask about artists. Like, I already asked about artists, but, if you could pick your poison and work with one dream artist, who would it be? It doesn't have to be current either. You could just pick from the history of comics if you'd like.
Oh, man. That's tough. I think, and this is something that might be an emotional answer. An artist I always wish I could have worked with was Darwin Cook.
Yeah.
I was such a great storyteller, man, and so passionate about it and so no nonsense about it. I think that guy has some of the most clean storytelling in comics ever.
Mm-hmm.
He did a cover for a graphic novel I did a long time ago, and it's something I'm very proud of that I got to do one thing like that, because I've liked his work for a really long time. I actually recently reread Batman Ego.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a book that, like, every page I just stop and just stare at it in awe, and just think a lot about it. And he's someone I wish I could have done something with, but even then, at the same time, I feel like if he and I worked together, I would have been holding him back. Right. I think he's such a great storyteller. And not just holding him back, though. Like, if I was given that opportunity back then, I probably would have learned a lot from it. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's one thing that I try to think about a lot about with artists is whenever I'm working with them, I try to learn something from them. I've been very thankful that I've gotten to work with such a wide variety of artists, because you learn things. You pick things up. I think that's something as a writer you should try to do. But with him, that would have been definitely something I just would have been really interesting to do. There's a lot of other artists that I like. I think Jim Lee is great. I think Jim Lee, I've been in the room with him talking about story a few times, and he approaches everything from an artist standpoint, very like, what's it going to look like? What's the visual of that? And getting his take on that. I was in a room with him about a story meeting last year, and one of my absolute favorite things from that meeting came from Jim sort of pushing us as the artist, being like, what does that even look like? Mm-hmm. How is that cool? How is that cool? How is that exciting on this visual level? And that got me super pumped up about an idea that we were working on at that time. And I was already a fan of that idea, but man, he took it, and it was one of my favorite things that's coming up in the next few years is from that conversation. I think Francis Manipool is pretty great. Mm-hmm. Oh man, Eduardo Rizzo.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so good. So Eduardo good. Rizzo. Yeah, really strong.
Have you read any Moonshine yet?
I have it like right behind my head right now. Like, I have the issues like right here.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. Yeah, his stuff in there is like the mood in it, because he's coloring himself. I think it's just really incredible. So next question. If you had to pick one non-Marvel, non-DC, non-Image comic as your favorite of 2016, what would it be?
Oh man, wait, not Image either?
Yeah, no, it has to be completely outside of those three. I'm challenging you.
I mean, I can give you, there's so many, I don't know. There are answers I could give you. There's a lot of different ones. I think Four Kids Walk Into a Bank is really strong. Like, I like Matt's work. Matt is a very interesting storyteller to me. There's a confidence there in his work, and there's, again, a thoughtfulness. I really appreciate when I'm reading a page and I can tell this is not the first take of this page. Right? Like, this is a person who worked on this and crafted this and really thought it through. Yeah, I like his work. I'm happy that he's doing like a lot of Marvel stuff. Yeah, I think that's a good one.
Yeah, that's a good pick.
Image too, and I was like, oh man, that's a tough one. I feel like having a baby has put me outside the bubble in a lot of ways, with what's coming up and what's going on, and kind of the comics that are sort of out there. There's things that are coming up I'm kind of excited about, and I think look pretty cool. I don't go to the comic shop as often as I used to now because of the baby, and so it's like whatever's on Comixology is kind of what I get. Oh man, the book that I haven't read yet that I really want to is that Jeff Lemire book with the Black Hammer.
Oh yeah, I've heard really good things about that.
I would too. Every time I see anything of it, I'm like, why am I not reading this book? But it's just about time.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I read a lot of stuff on Comixology lately because it's hard to get out to the store. I still have a pull, and so I go out there about once a month and I pick up all my stuff and I come back. But my pull list has gotten shorter this last year. I have tightened up on the books I was getting as well, just because of time and space.
I have as well. I've actually I switched to trade on pretty much everything that wasn't like going for an extended period of time. Like my rule was like double digits, but there were some books like, you know, Kaiju Max only goes 6 issues for each season. So like that's one I'd been reading for an entire season, so I was going to keep going. But I actually just recently started reading a lot of the other Rebirth books because you know, they just started coming out in trade. And man, I love that trade dress. That is awesome.
It's so good, right?
It looks so good.
Good job on their part. Yeah, so good. And they're all going to be like that. So that's something that I'm very happy with. I'm obsessed with that. I have all these books, you know, all these books on my shelf, and the white on the spine really helps it pop off the shelf.
Big time. Yeah. I the only one I've read in full so far is Superman, and man, that was awesome. I loved it. So
Superman is probably my favorite of the Rebirth books. I really like Green Lanterns, and I like Batman. I really like Detective a lot. Like, I think James is doing awesome work with Detective, and I like Supergirl. But man, that Superman book, I told Tomasi that too. I saw him a few months back, and I was just, man, so good, man, so good.
Yeah, I'm going to try to get Tomasi and Gleason on my podcast, because I actually want to talk to Tomasi at least in part about his editing career, because I don't know if you ever read Major Bummer, which he edited. That was from John Arcudi and Doug Mankey. And
I know what it is. Yeah, Doug Mankey.
Oh yeah,
I know what it is.
Oh, I love that book so much. And I remember I was in line getting signatures from him and Tomasi, or him and Gleason and Jeff Johns and Mankey. And I had Mankey's. He was doing sketches, I think, and he did a quick Lou sketch for me. And like Tomasi was super stoked about it. He was just like, "Yeah, Lou." And I don't know. I like that he looks fondly back on his like editing career and stuff like that too. Which is he must have a really I have to imagine he's had a really interesting career, just looking at some of the stuff he's edited and how he transitioned to being a writer and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I had talked to him more the last time I saw him. We started talking about, because it was a story meeting, we started talking a little bit about some of the story stuff, and he did approach certain things from an editor's standpoint, and because he's you know, some of the stuff we were talking about involves things that happened when he was an editor, and so he was able to kind of bring that perspective to it, which was really cool. Like, yeah, I wish I had taken more time to talk to him, but he was only there for the one day.
All right.
That Superman book is good.
What's that?
That Superman book is good.
Yeah, it's really good. So next question I have for you. Everyone has a vice or a crutch of sorts that they can't just quit. Like I'm like completely food obsessed. It's ridiculous, especially breakfast, but you know, whether that means like fancy coffee drinking or like eggs Benedict, that's kind of my deal. What's yours?
What's my vice?
What's your vice or crutch that you can't quit?
Oh man, that's tough.
Twitter. What's that?
Twitter, the internet.
Oh, that's a really good one. Actually,
you know, I drink a lot of coffee. That's one. I don't think I can get to a day without coffee. I've given up a lot of stuff that was previously bad for me. Like I've given up red meat. I've given up soda. I don't really have any like thing else like that. I think coffee is the one that I can't live without. You know, I miss red meat desperately. I'm trying to cut back on my cholesterol. It's all very personal stuff. I'm trying to cut back on my cholesterol.
Yeah.
And my wife was giving me all these things I couldn't have, and I was like straight up like the negotiator. You know, I'm just like sitting there like, what about this? I'll give up red meat. Hell, I'll give up meat. Period. If I can keep eggs and cheese, I will give up. You know, I will give up all meat. Like I will straight out just let me have eggs and cheese. Which sucks. Eggs and cheese are like really not great for your cholesterol. So I was like trying to like negotiate certain things. Coffee, but I mean, I only look at Twitter certain parts of the day and the internet sometimes. You know, it's funny because like I really like comic books, right? And I've always been very in the industry side of things, and so I'm always a little maybe too aware. I think that would be it. Sometimes I wish I wasn't as aware of what's going on and all the different aspects of things. But to that point, I do feel at this point, maybe it's because of the baby, maybe it's because of just my work schedule, I do feel like I am out of the loop on a lot of stuff. Like I will hear about things at a con and have no idea what people are talking about. And so, or I'll see like snippets of things and I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. And that's good and bad stuff about comics. I'll know certain stuff, but I do feel like I'm outside of the loop on certain aspects of things now more than ever. Like you were asking me about the book thing. Like I know some books, But it's funny, like I'll be talking to somebody and like, oh man, this book came out and it's selling really well and it's doing really well, and I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So maybe my plan is working of trying to cut back. And it really is just about work, man, distraction and mind space.
Oh yeah.
You know.
Yeah, Twitter is. I've talked to a lot of like artists in specific who used to say like video games were like their biggest like vice that they had to cut back on because video games eat up time like crazy. But I've heard a lot of other ones kind of switch it to like more like social media because you get so sucked in, and it also just kind of changes your mentality to a certain degree, and it's hard to kind of get back in the mindset you need to be to create.
Yeah, I would think that, and then there's this is gonna. I will tell you the one thing that I can never give up, and it's gonna sound really possibly silly. I don't know. I was talking to an editor about this a few months back. Alone time, man. Like I am very introverted. You know, you and I could talk all day long. I can go to a con, I can do a certain thing, but then when that's over, I'm exhausted. And like cons are exhausting for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I've started doing at cons a lot of times, and some of my friends get mad about this, but there's like at least one night every con I don't go out. Like I'll just sit in my room and order a pizza and just sort of chill out. And maybe I'll look at my computer, maybe I'll work a little, but it's just like that moment of silence. And we were talking about that earlier about, you know, I would do these things on Saturday mornings where I would just kind of wake up to an empty house and I would clean and cook and do something productive in that time period that wasn't deadline based.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of need that still, essentially.
Yeah.
You know, that's definitely something that's on my mind.
Yeah, I actually, speaking of the cons thing, I was going to bring up cons because I always find cons to be really interesting experiences for writers versus artists because, you know, artists obviously have a ton to sell versus writers who a lot of times, you know, you can bring books to sell and stuff like that, but it's not like you can do a writing commission. I guess you could do a writing commission. It would be weird. But anyways, when I went to Emerald City this past year, I, for the first time, didn't go out at any night because I was tired of like feeling like shit the next morning and like walking around like a zombie. And I felt great. It was weird. There was a part of me that was envious of like other people who were going out, but I felt really good. So
yeah, I don't get FOMO.
Yeah.
I don't get it. So I don't have a problem with like that kind of stuff. I also love story. I love when people can come to me and be like, "Oh man, this crazy thing happened last night. Let me tell you about it." I don't get like jealous. I'm like, "Yeah, tell me about it."
Like, you're like, "I like this.
Tell me the story." You know, yeah, I like this. This is what I'm gonna dig. Tell me all about it. And I like when people get like, even if they're embellishing, you know, and they act it out, whatever. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, cons. I've actually been cutting back on cons. I'm only doing 3 this year. Not counting like stuff like I'm going to ALA. I'll do some smaller stuff like that, some smaller signings, but. Yeah, like comes like actual travel for conventions. I'm cutting back to only 3 this year, and even then, I only go for a certain amount of days. Like I'll come back on like Saturday instead of Sunday or Monday.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to like. I mean, it's mental space, being away from the family. It's kind of like I enjoy it. Like I like being around people, and I love talking about comics with people. And sometimes it's really it does energize me. Sometimes, like there was a con last September where everyone that came to me. At everything I'm working on, the thing that everyone kept coming up to me and talking to me about was Birthright. And so, you know, I was already really excited about Birthright, but there was a moment there where I got really pumped about it. It kind of just reminds you why you're doing certain things.
Yeah.
And they come to you and they tell you certain bits and pieces of things that you're like, oh man, I'm putting this out there. People are picking it up. Like I'm putting out certain ideas in the writing and people are actually like getting what I'm trying to do. So it's like, oh man, but then again, all I do is go back home and get back to work.
Get back in your cave and get writing. All right. Yeah. I just have 2 more questions for you. Sure. One's a quick one might not be so quick. We'll find out. First one, if you could choose one thing, what would be the one thing that would surprise people the most about DC editorial?
Surprise them? If people are surprised at how hard DC editorial works,
I think they would be.
They work so hard. They are so passionate, man. They love it so much, and they know it. They know it. Like, you know, when you think of yourself as like a super nerd, and you think you know these characters, and you think you know the history of them, you go in that building, man, and it's the gauntlet. Like, they know what they're talking about, and they, not just in terms of what's going on currently, but what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
They can sit there and they can do the first appearance numbers and talk about specifics of this happened in this issue. And like, they know it really well, and man, they work hard. They work so hard, and they're so passionate about it. And they all want to make comics so badly, and not just comics, they want to make good comics, and they want to tell emotional stories. And it's one of my favorite things that happened in this last year is I've gotten to spend a lot of time in the office. Like, I know the office pretty well, and you get in that building and everyone is working their asses off, man, to make these books. And they're all fans, and they all have everyone's office and everyone's desk is covered in like their nerd paraphernalia. Mm. They all love DC Comics, but they work so hard, dude. We're talking about long nights. Yeah. And I don't want to speak for them, but I mean, it they're missing time with their family and friends to make comics. Mm-hmm. And it's very inspiring. It is nonstop for them. Yeah. And it is inspiring to see at times when you're there. But they're still having a lot of fun. Yeah. They still have a lot of fun doing it. I'm not sure if that would be surprising for people. I mean, they don't. I would be surprised that was surprising for people, but
I think it would
nuts,
be.
Dude. Like, yeah, when I was there. Yeah, I don't know. I comics is hard work, man. Like, Bryce from Boom was tweeting this morning. He tweeted that, like, every comic that comes out is a miracle.
Yeah.
And it's like, that is very true. A lot of things can go wrong. There's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of creative people, a lot of stuff going on, and it's very assembly line. There's a lot of people involved, and I think DC Editorial, they are very on the ball and very passionate, and they work a lot of hours to make these comics. Like, they work very hard to do it, and they're also very. I mean, for me, in my experience, they've also been very supportive of me and what I want to do with these characters and my thoughts on it. I don't know, man. It's interesting. Yeah. It's really interesting being around a lot of these editors and some of the people that are higher up, and just seeing how passionate they are about it and how hard they work. And they really care. They really care.
I think, like, maybe the biggest disparity between perception and reality in comics is, like, the role of the editor. And I don't know. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, I know those things. I've talked to editors before, and like
they're part of your creative team.
Yeah,
that's the thing that people need to accept sometimes. They're part of the creative team. Yeah. And there's someone for you to trust. I remember there was a moment last year. I was stuck on something, and I tweeted about it. I was like, I'm really struggling with this moment. And Kelly Sue DeConnick tweeted at me, and she was like, "You should call your editor." Like, she gets it, and she was right. And I did that like this morning. I was stuck on something on a Flash issue, and I just texted my editor, and I was like, "Hey, what's up with this? What do you think about this? Can you talk real quick?" And he, texted me back and was like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And then we talked for like 15 minutes and helped me work something out. They're not your enemy. Mm-hmm. The DC Editorial is, in my experience, not my enemy, and they just want to make good comics, man. They're just working really hard to do it.
Yeah. All right. Well, last question I have for you. This is in a weird change of pace for me. It is like a slightly heavier question than usual. Well, I mean, it's about creative, but it's also about kind of where we're at in the world right now. I've been kind of struggling with getting down to writing and doing things that are productive, because I've just been kind of downtrodden about, like, the world just feels very divided and feels very combative in a way that I can't remember it being before. I'm curious, how does, like, the tenor of, like, the world around you and, like, the country impact you as a writer, both from, like, a productivity standpoint and how you think about stories?
Man, I think about this every day.
Yeah.
It is very much. It's hard sometimes to, like, I'm thankful for the Flash, not just in terms of my career, but to to have to every day put myself in the mind of someone who is an eternal optimist has helped me to a limit. You know, I think about this all the time, and my answer is I just put it in the work.
Yeah.
You know, there's some stuff that I want to write that will very much express my feelings on these things. At some point, I'm not sure when, but man, yeah, it's something I think about every day.
Yeah.
I mean, and I just try to put it in there, and I'm thankful for Barry. I mean, it's funny how Barry is this optimist, and I'm, you know, for a long time I was very pessimistic, and it is hard, you know, it's very challenging, and I think about my wife and my daughter particularly. Not to say that I wasn't thinking about them before or other people before. I think it's easy to shut things off and to pretend there isn't a problem in the world. I think that was something that for a long time it was easier to do for me. And it has become very less so. So it's on my mind every day, you know, and I try to put in the work, you know, and it sucks that like a lot of people just, it's funny, my wife and I obviously talk about this all the time, and it's like, you know, I wonder if this is going to make this whole podcast end on a bummer, but it's like, you know, she always asks me, she asked for my birthday, what I want for my birthday, and I was like, I just want more time, right? It's a very Barry Allen answer, but it was true. I want more time.
Yeah.
And I just want to be able to, it's going to sound really silly, but it's like, I want to be an old man, you know? I look at these, a lot of creators and a lot of people in this world, and I feel for people who are older and are getting into like their twilight years. And I kind of go out in the world and seeing the world. It's got to be, I can't think of the right words for it. It's got to be a bummer to have lived a life and then look at the world now and question things and feel like this world is in a worse place than it was when you started in some ways.
Yeah.
You know, and think about like, man, I was hoping things would be better now. I think a lot about that, and I'm like very much in like, man, I just want to be an old man. I want everyone else to grow old too, you know, and I want everyone else to survive, you know. I want people to be able to live their lives. It's like this thing where it's like for a long time you were like, oh man, I want everyone to live happy. Right. I want everyone to live happy and have great lives. And now I'm very like, I just want people to survive and live their lives.
Right.
Like, just live. Just live. And not feel like their very livelihoods are threatened every single day, all the time. And so I think about that a lot, and I think about how easy it could be to shut your computer off, close your door, retreat into your house, retreat into yourself, and wait, right? And just kind of wait things out. This morning, I was thinking a lot about a poem. Hold on. I'm going to pull it up here.
Is this going to be my first poetry reading on my podcast?
Maybe. Let me. It was, you know, do not go gentle into that good night. Right. And that was on my mind a lot this morning about like, you know, rage against the dying of the light and that kind of thing. And putting that into the work. Yeah. You know, at some point someone is going to listen to this podcast and they're going to read a book from me in like a year or two, and they're going to be like, oh, that's why that's in that book. Right. You know, they're going to realize like that idea of that, like I can't, you know, talk is cheap, and you can only put so much out there on Twitter and that kind of thing. And I feel like for me, there's a quote, I'm going to paraphrase it, probably wrong, from David Lynch. I think maybe you and I talked about this before, where David Lynch, someone asked him about if he enjoyed talking about the work, talking about his thoughts on his own movies. And he was very like, no, the movie is me talking about the movie. Right. Like that's me talking about it. I'm putting it into it. Everything I have to say on that topic is in that. I wish I was more like that with my own work. I think that's the idea where I would like to be with my work. A lot of times I wish I could put a lot of that into it. And so when it comes to all these things and the world and my thoughts on it, my only answer is, because I think about it every day, but the only thing that I also do every day is I write every day. And
Mm-hmm.
so even if I didn't want to, it's infectious. Like, it would definitely affect my work anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, no.
That's my very long answer to that question.
No. I mean, it makes total sense. I have to admit, my answer for the present thing is the same. I always say more time. It's hard not to think about that, and it's hard not to think about how that's impacting you. But I do think it's interesting how reciprocal your relationship with your work is. It's like, your mindset is impacting the work, but your work is also positively impacting your mindset. And it is great to see. I mean, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I'm very thankful for Barry Allen.
Yeah.
It's funny, I think about Barry Allen, and this is all stuff that was built before me, right? Like, I mean, I didn't build Barry Allen's sense of hope and optimism, but I live with it every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's in my mind every day. Like, I think about Barry all day, every day. Even the only times I'm not thinking about Barry Allen is when I'm with my wife and baby, and even then, I think about family, and family stuff goes into my work. A lot of stuff. Well, Barry Allen, yeah. I mean, there's a moment. There are times where Henry will be talking to Barry, and those are things that I've either said myself or thought about, or thought about family. A lot of my thoughts on the two Wallies and their relationship in issue 9 and their friendship comes from that, and then that'll go on throughout, and like a lot of that stuff just goes in there, and then it comes back at me, and it helps me kind of figure some things out, and makes me think about my own life, my own family,
mm-hmm.
and what to appreciate. It all comes from good old Barry Allen.
Good old Barry Allen.
There's a. I already thought about this. I already knew this. It's already a part of Flash, but there was an episode of the Flash this season where HR, so not Harrison Wells, but HR,
right,
was talking, and he was like, the Flash's real power is not the speed, it's hope.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something about that character. I was thinking about this morning. I was writing an email about this morning to Tom, actually, to Tom King, mm-hmm. Talking about Barry Allen's sense of hope and how it does. It's not just that he has it, but that he helps other people find it, and he helps other people sort of inspire them to find hope. And it helps me find hope sometimes when things are very dark.
Yeah.
It helps me get through things. Yeah.
Well, I think that's fantastic. I just wish I could write the Flash so I could feel the same way. Help me. Hopefully
you can read the Flash and then get that. I don't know.
There we go.
Well, I mean, that's one thing about the book, is that it's hard. I can't have. One thing about Barry Allen's hope is I have to, as much as I love it and I find it inspiring in terms of drama and character, I have to constantly test it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something about writing that book. Sometimes it can be challenging because I have to constantly test his ideas about hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for answering my wide range of 20 questions.
That's okay.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time, and get back to writing, man. You've been away for too long.
I know. It's been almost 2 hours, so I better get it back on it. I've been getting texts from other creators and editors while we've been talking. I think bad, but just like asking questions about the story and stuff. So
blame it on
me. That was my first thing.
Blame it on me.
Text messages. Oh no, I will not do that. But yeah, I'll get back on it. Yeah, all right, man. Thanks, man. It was really good talking.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Joshua Williamson. You can find Joshua on Twitter at Williamson_Josh, and his work in comics like The Flash, Justice League vs. Suicide Squad, Nailbiter, Birthright, and Frostbite. Don't forget to like the show on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, follow it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or follow me at @slicefriedgold. Want more from Off Panel? Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, and give the show a rating and review while you're at it. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens and closes the show now. Give them a listen, as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.